Hello, my name's Jason Thompson. I'm a psychologist. These days I'm a psychologist at the San Francisco VA and assistant professor of psychiatry at UCSF. At the VA, I provide ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for veterans with treatment-resistant depression. Also involved in co-developing with colleagues some clinical trials around MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, and psychedelic psychotherapy, multiple compounds for moral injury. I grew up in England to an Irish family. My grandfather on my mother's side was a World War II veteran. My wife's paternal grandfather was also a World War II veteran, so I feel like it's no accident in a way. I've found my way ultimately to working with veterans. Should also say, independent of my professional identities, I'm a long-standing Zen and yoga practitioner and a writer and father of 2 teenagers, one here, Moss, turning 14 in a few short days, weeks, and Esther, just turned 18, both of whom grew up a few blocks from here. We've lived in the Mission for 25 years. Husband to Vivian here today, and I'm very honored to be here with you, Alex, today, and convening this important dialogue at this really amazing inflection point I feel we are at for the so-called psychedelic renaissance in general, but in particular thinking about, I believe, the very special role in particular played by veterans in this emerging movement here in the United States, and we can say more about that. With that said, perhaps Alex, you can introduce yourself now in any way that you feel you want to, perhaps beginning to then sketch out the path that you have walked from Army Special Forces, perhaps before, through to psychedelic healing and everything that has offered you.
Yeah. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And Bia, just for allowing the stage for us. And I think one of the reasons you probably invited me here was because I'm a walking contradiction and will be saying things that continually throughout this will contradict myself. And I think that comes from the multiplicity of selves, which we've talked about in great length, I think, throughout this whole weekend. I say that with also the kind of irony of this moment that we are sitting on stage, and there's no other veterans on the stage with me, which is humorous at best. I think there is a few of you in the audience, so I please welcome you to chime in throughout this conversation. But for those who know veterans, you know that we like to be on the news and we like to be at the forefront of conversations. And I think it's just true to form to say that there's not a lot of veterans here. To just call out the fact that there's not a lot of veterans here. To probably one of the best conferences I've been to in terms of psychedelics and this conversation of equity, this conversation of inclusivity, the conversation of bringing indigenous voices to the forefront. And there's not a lot of veterans here to represent that. And what does that mean when veterans are driving policy and they're not here having these harder conversations? So I'm not, I guess, naive to that fact, and I just want to call that to the forefront of this. And how do I introduce myself? We did our first ever LGBTQIA veteran retreat a couple months ago. And just to caveat, I support an organization called the Heroic Hearts Project, supporting I support that organization knowing that there's room for growth and knowing that we're not perfect, and also knowing that we're doing the best that we can. And every time I bring something to the forefront of the leadership and saying, what about this? They're like, yes, and let's do it. So we recently just had this all LGBTQ veteran retreat, and one of the participants introduced themselves saying, give me pronouns as I'm showing up in that moment, which I thought was just such a beautiful dialogue in terms of, again, the multiplicity of ourselves. So I've been using that recently now as well. My name is Alex. I work for that organization that I've spoke of. I was in the special operations community for a decade. I served under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. For those of you who don't know, that was a policy created to originally help protect queer people within the military, which what it did was marginalize and kick us out of the military. Thankfully, I survived that, and I did not get kicked out, and I played the game of assimilation for long enough for them to get rid of the policy and allow me to stay in. I also served with the, I don't want to use the terminology brainwashing, but the generation of 9/11 survivors. So I was someone who wholeheartedly believed that we needed to go fight terror when I joined the military. I also am a person who came from a very low-income family, and the military was my only option of survival. So going to the multiplicity of selves, right? Like I didn't join just because I wanted to go kill people in another country, and please, I know that that's probably a lot to hear, but I'm gonna be blunt during this conversation as well. I went because I had no other choice. And I think we need to call that out as well, that we look as a collective at where we are putting recruiting stations in this country and recognize that they are in low socioeconomic places. We are recruiting and marketing towards people of color, and the old saying, white rich men wage war and poor people fight it, is very true. So I joined, and I wanted to be the toughest of the tough, coming from a family with a lot of trauma. As a woman, I was told I could not do things, so I decided to prove them wrong. And 10 years into the war, they recognized and realized that half the population in Afghanistan and Iraq were women. Took them 10 years to figure that out, but they did eventually, and so they created a program where they attached women to special operations teams, Ranger Regiment, Navy SEALs, and the rest. I was a pilot program in charge of, or went through the selection for that program, went on to serve on multiple deployments to Afghanistan, supporting Ranger Regiment, Navy SEALs, Special Forces, and I knew on the first deployment what we were doing was wrong, and I continued anyway. And I continued because the only family or community or culture that I had ever known that was solid was the military. And when you see someone who you love get killed, that provides you a rage, and back to the conversation we had before this of like what a shadow is and what our shadows are, that makes you want to continue to do that fight. I finally woke up and realized I was not only killing myself, but I was killing everyone around me with my behavior. And to answer your real simple question of who am I, what brought me here, I drank myself into a hole and took drugs because they fed that to us, medications and the like. Our culture of the military is to do such things, like to drink and to take pills in order to survive and continue that work. No human wants to do that, but and they know that, so they feed us those things in order for us to survive. I got out and went as far west as I possibly could, thinking that the queer community would provide me a safe space. And this is probably not what all of you want to hear, but the answer to that was that's not true. That did not happen. Back to the intersections of all of our identities and where I focus my work now is I got out and I was not only a military veteran, but I was a veteran who went to Afghanistan. I was a veteran who has a gun in Seattle. Let me tell you, that was not something that people wanted to hear. And so I had no safe space. There was not a queer community that held me. And there was not a military community that held me, because there I was in 2020, protesting against people of color, or the horrible atrocities of what our police were doing in this country. So I wasn't Republican enough, and I wasn't gay enough, and so I went into a deep, dark depression. And the VA system fed me pills, and I was suicidal. And I finally had a friend call me and say, I can get you to Mexico. And that is what brought me here today. Is I got the healing that was not available to me in the VA system. And I found community in like-minded veterans who were trying to dismantle these identities that we've all created and built up, and a path to my own healing, and then a drive and a passion to support others in that space. And then I will pass it back over to you to ask another conversation, or have another conversation here. But I think back to Heroic Hearts Project and why I do support them and why I do appreciate the work that we're doing with them is that, again, we've acknowledged the fact that when you think of a veteran, you think of one demographic. And that is not the case. The minority of veterans that exist, it's important to acknowledge and to see. And it was talked a lot about during the Queering Psychedelics talk of what safe spaces look like, and what retreats that have someone who looks like you, has experienced the same things as you, and why that matters. And so we've done all-female retreats, all-female combat retreats. We've done LGBTQ retreats for veterans, and we're starting to get the funding to do BIPOC retreats as well. Because as a minority veteran, when you leave the veteran community, when you leave the military, not only are you like, whoa, what did I just do for a 20-year war? But then you're also saying, oh, I'm pissed. You realize, oh, I just left a racist, homophobic, sexist organization, and how do I peel that onion back, because I was a part of that organization. I was a part of that problem. I will stop there, and
you
please.
Can keep going. I'm happy just to continue to hear you for the rest of the hour, but I wonder if it might be useful for those in the audience who are not necessarily completely familiar with the nature of psychedelic healing, in particular for the very acute kinds of trauma, moral injury associated with war. Whether from your own experience, to the extent you're comfortable sharing that, or through Heroic Hearts, what we have seen in this is probably not unfamiliar to the audience, hearing about the experience of veterans all the way back, right? Certainly Vietnam, certainly before that, is the existing attempts to provide healing haven't really worked, right? 17 suicides a day, right? So what is it about the nature of psychedelic medicines, entheogenic medicines, that, in your observation or experience, has opened the door towards healing for veterans in the aftermath of being in the midst of perhaps the most acute horrors imaginable sometimes?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I think it's in, I already mentioned this, but I think it's in the being able to hold all of those parts of ourselves. If someone's really willing to go do the deep work of knowing that there's just all of these different parts of ourselves, we've seen it with the MDMA trials, where that has obviously been, for those who are, I'm sure everyone is aware, of that being rolled out and soon to be rolled out in the VA systems, is the ability to say both and, right? Shame is a powerful thing that has spread throughout all aspects of our society in so many different ways, but in the military community specifically, it's I have trained you and taught you to become a killing machine and a monster, and now I'm just going to send you back to the reality of what the real world is. And I had a friend who wrote an article for the New York Times that said, I'm ready to talk about my time in Iraq. Are you ready to listen? And that moment for a veteran that comes home and shares something that's pretty atrocious, you know, that's just the reality of war, and have someone look at you like you're a monster is the moment you have shame and the moment you stop talking about those experiences, because the reality is that people aren't really wanting to hear it. I have a lot of friends who I get the, it's like when you, this is gonna sound so horrible as a metaphor or an example, but when someone, when someone like gets a divorce, or when someone has someone lose somebody, and you kind of give the, oh, how you doing? You know, the like to the side look. And I've gotten this of like, oh, why did you join? You know, the judgment without saying anything. And I always find that humorous, because I'm just like, we just had different paths, my friend. We talked about this before too, of we're an all-volunteer force. The only difference between, you know, the Vietnam War and our war was that we were an all-volunteer force, that's just good propaganda. That's just good messaging, right? But to answer your specific question with like, let's go back to MDMA. It enables someone to hold multiple truths at the same time. I did bad things, and I'm a good person still. I killed people to survive, because that is what I was trained to do. And when your back is against the wall, you may make those same decisions, or you run. And I'm still a good person. And that is a hard reckoning to sit with. And that monster, if you want to call it that, but like that part of me is never going to go away. It's always going to be there. It's how I've integrated that person into my life. Do I shove that down into a corner and say, I never want to look at that again? Or do I say, hey, I hear you, I love you, and you did the best that you could? And I think that is what this medicine is allowing people to do in a different way. Where I will say, again, I'm going to contradict myself so many times, that I'm very proud of the veteran generation, this generation of veterans, to say, we're not doing this anymore. Look at the Vietnam era of veterans, and this is not me throwing shade. They did not have the support they needed or the help they needed. But this is me saying, they drank themselves into a hole, and they impacted an entire next generation of kids that then grew up to raise us, that programmed us to think, yes, we need to follow the military-industrial complex, and this is the right path. And we're saying no more. We're saying, let's stop that.
Thank you. You answered that difficult question in an incredibly compelling way. You talk in that response, Alex, about a lot that comes across is about multiplicity, and the conference in some ways is a tribute to the necessity to consider multiplicity and intersectionality. I'm curious, in my experience of within the VA of working with veterans, veterans are not a homogeneous group, right? There are massive differences across generations, the Vietnam era, the OIF, Iraq, Afghanistan era, between male-identified veterans, female-identified veterans. So I'm curious around, at this inflection point when we are at a moment of potential massive opportunity for implementing this hopefully new and hopeful form of treatment, but potentially also a moment of real risk that we could really mess this up. I'm curious what is your hope around ways in which large systems, VA perhaps central among them, can offer psychedelic intervention in a way that is is attentive to the need to create intervention that acknowledges and honors that multiplicity for affinity groups. So that's one piece of my curiosity for you. The other piece is around what is going to be the optimal way to deliver the intervention, right? You, as a member of the armed forces, you deploy as a member of a team or a platoon, and then in medical systems, primarily you're treated as an individual veteran. And so I wonder about that, about maybe either the need or at least the option for something more like a group deployment into healing. So two pieces: multiplicity of provision of the treatment, but also what is the treatment?
Yeah, I think it goes to the first piece that I stated here is the irony that there's not a lot of veterans here. Because we are pushing out a huge policy shift. We are leading the charge in a large policy change, and the VA system is just universal health care, if we want to be honest with ourselves. And we are about to roll out, MDMA treatment across that, which, if we're talking about access and we're talking about equity, is so amazing. Right? It is so amazing that is about to happen, because not everyone can go down to Mexico. Not everyone can go to Peru. And that allows the doors to open to support so many veterans who do not have access. And at the same time, by doing that, we are going to sterilize the shit out of this medicine. and how that is problematic, right? So again, both things can be true at the same time. And we're seeing it already. We're seeing it in the Portland system right now. We're seeing it in the fact that you have to go to these clinics in order to use psilocybin, and what that's going to do to care, and like sterilizing the care, right? And taking away the ritual and taking away the community from the treatment. So I think that can be very problematic, right? And then on top of that, to your point of like the intersections of identities and what care should look like, I think there is people within that system who are trying to do right by it, one of which is Christopher at the Portland VA, who is doing his best to create a system where we are honoring these intersections, and we are doing group care and group treatment. We can do psilocybin in ceremony, in that impact of, which is what the Heroic Hearts Project model is, of group. God, you guys said it so much better than I am right now with in the queer and psychedelics conversation. But the mirroring to each other of me too, you know. We did an all-female combat veteran retreat in December, and there was military sexual trauma survivors, there was combat veterans, it was the gamut. There was 15 women there. Out of the 15, 12 of which had been abused as a child or abused or raped in the military. The ability for them to take the medicine out of it, the ability for them to look at each other and say, me too? And how amazing was that? That was healing in itself. And that goes true for the flip side of men in the military. If you really want to peel back the onion, and we're talking a lot about the patriarchy and systems and all of that, right? The military is the ultimate patriarchy, right? Is the ultimate example of that. It's this insane, incessant, powerful, toxic masculinity. And then you look at who joins and why they join. Because they were hurt. Because they were hurt little boys. And that is some of my favorite work, is working with those clients and working with those men. Because you take a group of men in a retreat setting and they say, oh, hey, I had someone rape me in the military. I had somebody, when I was a little boy, hurt me. And so I grew up and said, that's never going to happen again. And I'm going to become the toughest of the tough. And I'm never going to let anyone hurt me again. And so then they take that anger and they take that sadness and they go hurt other people, right? Like, let's peel back the onions. And so to the treatment, that is in the healing. That's the healing. Because when they see another man break and say, oh my gosh, me too, crack open. And if we take that away in this medical model, we are going to fail in the system. We are going to fail because that is where the community comes in.
Thank you. I suppose there's a broadening to some extent from questions around the direct intervention itself, and circling back to some of your comments around the nature of the quote-unquote all-volunteer force. We're here with Chakruna thinking about the nature of how do we build a psychedelic culture? How do we build a healing culture? And there's this line from the end of Michael Herr's book about Vietnam dispatches, which is Vietnam, 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 we've all been there. Which is a very curious line, right? Because it's like, well, at the time, a lot of people, a lot of Americans had been there, but many had not. And certainly now, we're in a culture where there are those who join the military. There's an enormous class, economic divide there. And then there's a much larger contingent of those of our civilians who do not, and who have the luxury of being able to, for the last 20 years, potentially close our eyes to this. And my sense is that in order for genuine healing and transformation to take place, there may need to be some kind of a change in the relationship of that dynamic between the veterans at the quote-unquote sharp end of the spear and the rest of us who we were complicit whether we knew it or not, and whether we liked it or not, at the very minimum by virtue of the 50% of our taxes that funded the Pentagon. So this is a long preamble to really ask you around, especially given the very unique role played by veterans in the psychedelic movement now. You, in some ways, I sense that this was Rick Doblin's original, I think, very inspired thought, that by virtue of the broad bipartisan support, rightly so, for veterans, that to the extent we could create the possibility for veterans to receive psychedelic healing, it would open the conversation and provide credibility for psychedelics in a broader sense. I also think that then should give and should accord veterans, such as yourself, Alex, a unique voice we need to listen to in the wider sense around what kind of broader change in the culture we are looking for the wounded warriors who are able to hold all of the multiple parts and then point the way with the heroic heart towards what is the path of healing towards the collective. So, yeah, sorry, another slightly difficult question, but why not?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it. I had a really great thought and I just lost it because it's been a long day. I think that goes to, I made a point about Vietnam earlier, and maybe I didn't really drive it home in the way that I wanted to, which is the difference being that we're an all-volunteer force and there was a draft. And what that does to a society is that when those soldiers got home, there was an entire population of people protesting that war because they didn't want to be a part of it, and for good reason. And when we got home, all we got was the pendulum swung, which we like to do in our society, right? And we auto-corrected, and we gave you the thank you for your service, without knowing what that means behind it, without knowing that what you just said is, I support this too, because I'm not doing anything about it either. And I think that that's what we need to wake up to as a collective. Just because you didn't join And I hope I'm not sitting on this pedestal preaching to anyone. Please know that. Like, I am a pacifist. I do not believe in any war at this point. I hope we never have them again, which we continue to do, and we're continuing to do right now, because America likes to stick their noses in places they don't belong. But if we're going to sit here and have a reckoning, if we're going to sit here and heal as a collective, that means that we all have to wake up to the fact that we are all complicit. This is why, again, Bia probably likes that I'm sitting on the stage or hates it. But when we first met, she called me out and said, "Blood is on my hands," essentially. She said it in a much more eloquent way, but that is what she said. And I said, "So is it on yours?" It's, if I am you and you are me, which is what we believe in this space for those who have done psychedelics and done psychedelic work, we are all connected. Which means we were all complicit, which means we're all complicit right now with the atrocities of war across the country and across the world. So I think that reckoning needs to happen, right? It's not just thank you for your service. I want you to know what that means behind it, and how we as a collective can come together and acknowledge the shadows that we all are holding on to as a collective society.
Thank you. I could ask more questions, but I wonder if it might be a time now to present the opportunity for others to ask questions, especially if there are veterans in the audience, but others too.
Yep. Do you want to come down here? We have about 15 minutes, just for timing. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Brooke, and first of all, I just want to say thank you for being here today and representing the veteran population. It's kind of crazy that you're the only one up there, as you mentioned, so I just want to thank you for the words that you're speaking and the knowledge that you're sharing with everyone. As a veteran myself, I got out this past October, serving active duty, and we talk a lot about veterans after they leave the service, but my experience in leading soldiers was that I had many soldiers ranging from the age of 18 to in their 40s coming to me saying they were having challenging experiences, with their mental health. And there was very insufficient resources while they were in service to be able to address those. So I guess I just want to know, maybe you have some, either of you maybe have some insight on the future of active service members being supported with psychedelics as well as veterans. So.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I'll do the cheesy thank you for your service. Which I learned recently, you're supposed to say thank you for your support, and I had never said that before. So, well, I think if it was up to some people, psychedelics would already be being given out to military veterans. But I want to be very clear. I am the only one up here representing this, and which is absolutely ridiculous. And I probably don't sound like a lot of other veterans you've heard or talked to, right? So this is my opinion and not the opinion of Heroic Hearts Project. I just want to blank statement that. I do not think it's going, let's do it. Let's see what happens if we start giving psychedelics to actual active duty participants, but I can tell you that I don't believe all of them will want to pick up a gun again. So I don't know what would happen. Maybe it would help dismantle the military-industrial complex. I don't know, But also what I fear is that if we do that in a clinical setting, we are going to hurt people even more. Because you are doing psychedelics, you are dismantling your identity, you are having maybe ego death, you are opening your heart up and becoming vulnerable. And then we're like, okay, go back to war. That's just gonna, talking about neural pathways and the science behind it, that is gonna double down and make some pretty unhealthy people out there. So I actually really worry about, I make this beautiful statement like the good things are going to happen, but let's talk about the realities of what might actually happen, right?
I think that's my worry too. Perhaps yes, the active duty military would be unwilling to return to war, but I think it's worth acknowledging the shadow history that we know about, right? MK Ultra and the attempt to use psychedelic medicines as a weapon of war. So I wouldn't necessarily assume that the potential application is towards pacifism.
You know, and then another piece of that, just for those who don't know, the system has, the culture of an entire military has to change, and that's going to take decades, which is, if you have a top secret clearance in the military and you seek mental health support, that is slowly shifted, but you can get your clearance taken away, which means your job is taken away, which means your identity is taken away. So people don't get and seek help. Until those things change, this is going to be a system and a problem within the system. And then on the flip side of that, and this is where I may get pushback from the other veterans in the room, but we have a VA system that capitalizes and incentivizes you staying broken. Your rating is attached to your ailments and disorders and PTSD. And as long as that's happening, where if I say I no longer have those symptoms, then I'm no longer going to get the financial support. Veterans are going to continue to latch on to their identity being wrapped around their mental health, and those things need to be decoupled in order to heal. So it's a multifaceted, problem. I don't have the full answer.
I want to make a comment again. Sorry, I didn't put myself in the program, and then I'm jealous of all the speakers that are on stage. And I just want to say that we did have many more veterans originally in this panel, and one by one fell through, and the last one was very unexpected, like today. I do have a slight mysticism kind of approach to things. I think it's not for nothing that it's just Alex, because really, when do you get to see like a powerful queer vet woman talking against, the military complex industry?
Thank you.
And yeah, this is, a highly sensitive topic. I think that divides people from the U.S. and not the U.S., and I wasn't born and raised here, although I do have an American citizenship now. I didn't grow up like thinking that the vets were like heroes. As a Brazilian, the U.S. invaded a lot of countries in Latin America, and it's different for us. And I've been educated in all the paradoxes and challenges, that the vets suffer as kind of also people that have been sold lies and have believed in things and didn't sometimes have other options. So it's very delicate, but as a member of the psychedelic community, I've always felt a little bit bothered by, a lot of emphasis on how to heal the vets and the trauma they suffered, but much less emphasis on how to heal the trauma that they inflicted on other populations. And that's a very crucial piece that I feel is missing on the psychedelic community. And when I met Alex, I just threw it in there right away in the first second. And that's how our friendship started. And that's why she's here today, because that's very delicate. How do you honor this system? And, there are things that are important that happened through the U.S. military system, but there's also abuses and mistakes, and where do you walk this line? And how is the psychedelic community talking about it? And that's, I never see. So I want to push back against, there's a lack of representation of vet things, because on my angle, there's an over-representation of vet things on psychedelic communities, repeating a lot of tropes sometimes, like
Heal Americans in America. I don't know if you've heard that one.
We always, like our conferences, we try to make the stars are the people that have less visibility. So it was actually a great compromise to invite Rick Dobling on stage, because we never invite like the big celebrities, because they already have a voice, and we're trying to give space to other voices. So for us to bring veterans is kind of, where do we draw the lines? Because I do think that vets get a lot of funding, attention. And so, yeah, I just want to throw my perspective. And I want to encourage you to keep up the good work. And, I admire you, and I think we need more people like you. And I also want to honor the, Some people saw that movie, From Awe to Shock, Shock to Awe. One of the main characters, I forgot his name now, but he was, I hang out with him a lot, and he was a poster boy of psychedelic healing, and he died tragically, you know, Matt. Yeah, Matt was, psychedelics made him a pacifist, and, you know, ideology to, like, change the military. And while he was, like, advocating for this in public, he was still struggling in private, and he ended up dying. And so it's an ongoing thing, you know, this healing, and I want to honor his memory here, and I want to thank you again. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I just want to say one piece to that I think is important, and going back to just like the constant contradiction, and that the world is not binary and war is gray. I can look back at my military service and say, whew, you know, that was a lot, and a lot of it I did not agree with. And there was 100% a white savior complex of, I'm going to go save the women and children of Afghanistan. And at the same time, we did show a generation of women in that country that they have power and they have strength and that they are allowed and should be allowed to go to school. And my job in the military after we handed the country over, in quotations, which we should have never taken in the first place, but was to train and female special operations, female Afghan special operations. And when the pullout happened, they were the first ones to be, not attacked, what's the word I'm looking for? Sought out after to be killed. Thank you. I've left all my military jargon behind. They were the first to be targeted. And so we collectively came together as veterans to rescue them and pull them out of the country, and now they are citizens of the United States. And those women are thriving and flourishing in America. And so again, the multiplicity of war and what that looks like, and these women are some of my closest friends, and I love them dearly. Yeah, it's fucking complicated, man. Like, it's just complicated. And I think we need to acknowledge that.
Thank you for the invitation. Welcome home. I think welcome home is like the preferred greeting for a lot of troops. Welcome home to you also. I was like welcomed home in a ritual way on a reservation in North Dakota. I think America lacks cultural rites of passage for the youth to adulthood beyond militarism. And so I'm curious for you, like, what do you think if we are going to reimagine the future for our community? Not only like how can we keep our warriors home and, you know, disrupt this unjust and immoral interventions, but what would a welcome home look like optimally for you?
Thank you, and I'm so glad I met you this weekend, so I'm excited to continue a conversation. I'd be curious your response to that, but I do think, you know, when we look back at like World War II, right? When soldiers came home, they came home on a ship, and there was a long period of time where they, you know, had the ability to sit in community with their brothers and realize what they had just been through together before they got home. When you're talking about the global war on terror, or you're talking about the Vietnam War, the Vietnam War probably had a little bit of that too, but we would go overseas, for me, example, go on a 4 or 5 month deployment, nightly, you know, missions, combat missions over and over and over again. I would come home, one day I would be in Afghanistan, and the next day I would be in North Carolina, having cocktails with my friends. And the juxtaposition of that, and then what that does to someone's brain, it is just, and to come home to an entire country who within the first six years, I'd say they paid attention, and then after that it was like no one even knows what's happening, is really mind-altering. I remember I was leaving for my second or third deployment, and I was getting some booze at the grocery store, and the woman, I showed her my ID, and she goes, "Aren't you so glad Obama just announced that we're ending the war?" And I just was like, yeah, I am so glad. I leave tomorrow. So just the lack of awareness. So to your question is, I think ritualistically indigenous people have done so well with warriors and fighting, and you come back to a collective community that helps us heal together. And if we have to go to war, I think that's the answer. I think that's what that looks like. And I don't know how that looks like in America, because we live in such an individualistic society where we don't even know our neighbors. So let alone someone who comes home from war and how we greet them and show them we grieve together. But my hope would be that that's what we create. I hope that we move away from the society that we've created right now and we live in more community. So I don't know if that...
My thoughts on that really are kind of informed both by experience working with veterans with very similar experience coming back, and one day being on a mission in Afghanistan and then walking through a mall in Detroit and trying to have conversations with people like, like, so what was it like? I'm like, okay, just it's incommunicable, right? And the sense then of the compounding of the traumatic experiences by virtue of their being born alone, right? That there's something about in some ways, my sense clinically of what is traumatic about traumatic experiences is that they are born alone, right? And that to the extent they can be held through either the therapeutic situation or the group, there is a way then of holding it in a broader sense, which doesn't remove the experience, but creates the possibilities for it to be, for something that is too massive for the individual soul, psyche to hold, to be held together. And that I think is what we need to move towards.
Yeah, and I know we're wrapping up here, but the last thing I will say to that, thank you, I think that's beautiful. And I would be remiss to say, when people talk about PTSD, they talk about all these symptoms and, the DSM and all these things associated. If every veteran here probably can look at me and say the same, which is, were you in a grocery store when you got home and you had an anxiety attack because there's too many goddamn peanut butters to choose from? That's what that feels like. We're in this capitalistic overabundance, and we're just like, what is happening? The juxtaposition of those things and how we come to terms with ourselves and the world, and we need your help. I'll end it with that. There's still veterans going to war right now. We may not be at war, but I promise you there are still active duty soldiers that are going overseas and being told what to do and carrying those missions out currently today. And if we want to heal as a collective community, then we need to support each other in a real way, which is not asking you what you did over there or not asking you how many people you killed, is to ask you how your heart is and if you're okay. So I'll leave it with that.